Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Anderson. I'm the Director of Collections, Exhibitions, and Programs at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Nordic Innovation Series program, Sustainable Urban Development. This program has been brought to you by Neste, the Nordic Council of Ministers through Neighbors to the West, Scan Design Foundation, the Barbara Oster per Suecia Foundation, Embassy of Sweden, the Consulate General of Norway in San Francisco, and Manning and Napier. This third program will be led by Johan Strand, who develops multifamily housing in all shapes from affordable to market rate through the family-owned JSRE. JSRE combines global experience with local knowledge to create sustainable Scandinavian-designed homes. Johan, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Leslie. Good morning and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. This is very exciting for me, at least. I always think about it like, who do you want to have over for dinner and just enjoy a great conversation? And this is the group of people I would have chosen. So fortunately, this is a virtual living room. So come on in. It would be hard to do it in my own living room. So we can take to the next slide. You can see that just in terms of the history of timber buildings, we've come a long way in a short while, just in terms of the height of it all. You can see here almost just in a decade, we've increased the tallest building by, almost 60 meters. And for all the Americans, that's almost 200 feet. So in the next slide, we can actually see the tallest building, which is Mjøstornet. I'm sure all the Norwegians would not be happy by how I pronounced that one with my Swedish Norwegian. So this is now the tallest mass timber building in the world in Norway, just adjacent to a beautiful lake. It is almost 270 feet tall, 85 meters. And it's actually interesting because we're going to get into a discussion, but it has a variety of uses from hotels to offices, apartments, and even a swimming hall is in that building. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see the tallest timber building in Sweden, which is up in Skellefteå. And it's also multi-use. It's a culture center, so it has even 6 theaters. It's also a hotel, restaurants, and it's almost 80 meters. So I guess shave off 15 to 20 feet of that one. And then the next slide, just in terms of how, what the future holds, this company just launched, and the big partner is the Starchitect, Björke Ingels, and they're going to do CLT with modular production. And they just now have announced one project down in San Jose. So obviously Björk is Danish, so we kind of see how the Nordics are coming over to the US to help out here. And just in terms of who we have now to help us educate us, we have Marie Johansson from Sweden, who's a very prominent researcher and works at RISE. We have Tobias Levey from Forterra, who just now is under construction for their CLT facility and does modular production. And Susan Jones, who's a long-term architect and does a bunch of CLT. And actually one of her projects is the tallest timber building in Washington State. And you will also see behind her, her own house, which is built in CLT. So I think we should kick it off with Marie will give a brief description of the Swedish side of things, and then Susan can give background on the Seattle and the US side of things, and finally Toby will describe his world experience of CLT and mass timber. So I hand it over to Marie.
Yeah, thank you. So Marie Johansson, senior researcher or project manager at RISE, which is the research institute in Sweden. But I'll start to show some images as well. Now let's see and share. And here you can actually see the hotel, 20-story building when it's finished in Sweden, with the hotel and the cultural center at the bottom. And But I'll talk a little bit about what happens with wood buildings in Sweden and why we have managed to build quite a lot of knowledge during the last 25, 30 years. And the Research Institute in Sweden is one of the partners that is helping with this development. In Sweden, a few years ago, we joined all our industry research institute together to get one large research institute that combined the forces from many different types of industrial areas, we can say, to then have the possibility to build, to collect knowledge from many areas, where our side with from the wood to almost from the forest through the sawmills to the finished timber buildings, and now today as well circularity, which is coming in as a big issue. But being in a huge university with many competences give us also knowledge from other industries that is of use when changing the building industry into both in direction of industrialization, but also in terms of sustainability, getting a lot of new ideas from other industries, can say. And like that. But if we talk about timber building, as many knows, it was not allowed to build timber buildings taller than 2 stories in Sweden and most of Europe for almost 100 years, until the codes was changed in 1994. So up until then, we built nothing in timber more than 2 stories. Today, 20% of the market for residential multi-story buildings is in timber. So it's been a huge change in these last 25, 30 years. And we can also say we build not everything in mass timber. We are also building a lot with this technology that also have been used a lot in the US with prefabricated, in our case, in the most case at least, with lightweight stud and frame systems. A lot of the buildings from 3 to 6 stories is built in that technology. But if we go up higher and coming more and more into the market is this with CLT. If we talk 4 to 8 stories, we often build it in CLT or is in glulam frames. And when we build even higher, it definitely goes over to CLT or glulam. Now we should say that there are not many buildings that are taller than 8 stories. There's a fire limit there that we changed the codes a little bit. But you saw one example at least of taller buildings. And then how could we do this change from building nothing to building 20% of everything in 25, 30 years? And we can say that it was a matter of learning. It's a steep learning curve, of course, if going from nothing. But it started, we can say, in 3 municipalities where we had a strong collaboration between the municipality that said that we need to change and have one more material, to the industry, and together with research, to gather knowledge and the capability of building this. We can say that it started in 3 municipalities that had a vision for this, but it's now spreading a lot around. And so we can see timber buildings in almost all Swedish cities today. And we can say that it's the same in many other of the Nordic countries today. But what has RISE contributed in this? We can say, well, RISE has been working with timber, or the former research institute called Trätek or SB, with these development. And it started a lot with technical development, we can say, material, building systems. And then we can also say that the first timber building, more than 2 stories, we actually went to the US to get the knowledge how to do that. And then we have developed from there. All the technical issues we are dealing with a lot. But today, maybe we know a lot about how to deal in the technical issues, moving more into softer question with business models, how to make this affordable. Health issues, is it better to live in wooden buildings, and architecture? What we can say about the Research Institute is that we create knowledge, but we do that together within the industry and the university. And then we gather knowledge. But the most important part is actually to spread the knowledge And for RISE, this has been a lot in handbooks that has been used and working together with the industry. And one of the main thing that always is talked about when discussing timber is that we need more knowledge. And what we actually talk about is education and learning more and showing what is possible to do. And these demonstration buildings that has been built, and so spreading knowledge. And I think you'll hear that from many more partners that talking today, that's important. But here we can actually see what can be done then. This is an area in Växjö, where I live, where we have built a lot of timber buildings. In this case, I think there's over 500 apartments built here in timber, mostly in CLT in the last 10 years. And with that image to show what can be done, I think we can move to the next one.
Thank you, Marie. That's great. And I think also it's interesting how RISE, you said you worked with the US, but also Susan has worked with RISE. It's interesting how there's a lot of collaboration being done between the two countries or regions.
Yes.
Susan, you want to kick it off?
Yes, let me just share my screen. Just while I'm doing that, it really was exciting to come onto this panel and to realize that, in fact, the researchers from RISE, we had been doing at atelierjones research work with them for the last 2+ years, and we're actually applying for another grant with them right now under the auspices of the American Wood Council, which is really exciting. But I want to address a question that I see coming up in the chat before I get going. Johan, I hope you don't mind. There's some questions about what is CLT and what is GL, and that's a really good question. And for anybody who doesn't know that, it would be impossible to follow what we're talking about. Just a little bit, I'll take a little bit of my time. In America, as Marie said, we do build a lot in wood, and we have traditionally, because we have a younger country and a younger forest stock, and we've been building in wood for a long time. We used to build in these big, heavy timber pieces that you've all seen in the beautiful warehouses all around Pioneer Square and restaurants, etc. Now, of course, those elements are declining in their availability, and we don't want to cut down old growth forests anymore. And also, we have this tradition of building in timber, light wood frame timber. So those are the 2x4s and the 2x6s and the 2x8s that you see in Home Depot, and everybody's built with them on this call. That's very different from mass timber. And mass timber is a new kind of late 20th, early 21st century product that is engineered wood panels, really large, like 8 feet long by 40 feet long, that are built in their big and heavy panels, and they allow us to build tall. So they allowed us to go up to those 18 stories and potentially more that you saw in Marie's presentation. And they're the basis of how we're changing the codes in America to allow us to do that. So it's a really new technology that I'm going to now jump into my presentation. And I'm really thank Marie for her presentation. I'm going to be telling kind of a story on how that happens, because it brings in so many different into different levels, how you change a building industry that's been used to building in light wood frame for smaller buildings in the 2x4s and 2x6s versus how you replace the really heavy carbon emitting concrete and steel buildings with something that's a lot less carbon emitting, like mass timber, including CLT and GL, which I guess I forgot to say, stands for glue-lam columns, glue-lam beams. So think about big, heavy pieces. So one of the things that I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I tell a little bit of story about how all of these pieces came together in my life, because it started with building this house. So if you'll forgive me, I have to get this into full screen. One moment. Full screen mode. Okay, cool. So it was really deep in the last recession in 2008 that I would venture night and night again into my atelierjones model shop to build another model for our little single family house. We were designing it in Madison Park. And this is a story about digging deep to rethink how we work as architects and as people working in the built environment. What is our time for? How can we keep focused on our time here at hand? And what will our impact be? These models emerged into a house, and the house became a larger study of ecology, okos plus logi. Okos means house. And it began to may help me think how to reinvent our relationships to our Pacific Northwest forests and their life-giving carbon-storing wood. So this little house, our family house that I'm in right now, became a story of how to reinvent our building industry and how to build with lower carbon materials and how to reduce the impact of concrete and steel construction that so dominates our building industry with its very heavy carbon footprint. But then the tall, mute, mass timber blanks also became tectonic poetry in the falling light. And if I hadn't fallen in love with their prefabricated lower carbon footprint, I now fell in love with their subtle angles, designed with software and cut with giant CNC machines. This was not my journey alone. I reached out to universities, the University of Washington, my students there, and fellow faculty to understand the carbon footprints, the manufacturers, the rural economies that were ruined by the past failures of the timber industry, especially in Washington state, and state legislatures. I wrote a book that I shared around the world from New York City to London and had discussions with Tokyo firefighters. We learned together, we shared together, we created allies and community, including, I must say, with Forterra, that Toby represents. And this community grew and the allies expanded. Legislators from both sides of the aisle in Washington, DC and Olympia recognized the power of the material that came from broken rural economies and could create housing for people in the city, in the heart of our sometimes divided cities. Tapping into that power and harnessing it for good to change our highly carbon intensive construction industry in the United States to a lower carbon one, to transform fraught and anxious forestry wars into careful, thoughtful dialogue, became a vision of the future, of safe, lower carbon wood buildings built out of well-managed, sustainable, and thriving forests all across this country, helping people and securing livelihoods. So the sharing continued. At the request of National American Institute of Architects, representing the voices of 90,000 architects, I was requested to be at the table of firefighters, fire chiefs, concrete and steel lobbyists. I waded very reluctantly into the technically uber precise world of code officials and shared all pro bono over 2.5 years, my time and intimate knowledge of mass timber, all spent in bad hotels and windowless conference rooms for almost 3 years to write thousands of lines of dull administrative building code, all collaboratively. Scale was the vision. A house is a beautiful refuge, a church inspires, but the tall timber buildings made of these large, clunky, strong cross-laminated timber panels were going to have a real quantifiable impact on our profession's carbon footprint, which already so dominated our negative global carbon footprint. We invented new typologies of new tall buildings. We tested their life safety capacities by building buildings and burning them down again and again, or at least trying to. We created new details and new patterns of light to fall against the natural of the wood, balanced against protective sheaths of Typex gypsum wallboard. Let me be clear, this was a war. The stress that appears on my face here, testifying to hundreds of national building code and fire officials, is no accident. We counted the votes and assembled voices across the country to speak out against well-organized forces of concrete and steel industries and their sometimes partners, earnest but anti-forestry lobbies that could not see the forests for the trees. And then we won, and the code became law. Today I am back in my architectural office in downtown Seattle, working on projects. The code is law in multiple US states, in Washington state, available for all jurisdictions and project teams across the country to use as they will, including my own project team. atelierjones is building again, and we have the opportunity of a lifetime to design and build with the very codes I helped write and to help test them with new collaborative partners, from contractors to engineers to code officials to my colleagues in my now growing atelierjones office. This is the light falls gently into the small space we designed, these small studio apartments on Capitol Hill in Seattle. The sound of buses and sirens fade in the distance as the subtle smell of the forest envelops. High over the trees, high up in one's 8th floor space, looking out safely, the city is revealed, surrounded by soft, natural wood. But it is important not to rest quietly. It is important to continue to build communities where there are still unanswered questions. Just last fall, for instance, I was transported via Zoom to a Swedish building with the RISE researchers that Marie mentioned, to a site outside packed with international fire scientists under gray Swedish skies, where we set yet another mass timber building on fire 5 times in a row, and we still could not burn it down. It is important to take action in this time of climate change. Find your place and take action during your time, wherever you are. All through this COVID pandemic, I've returned to my family forests with my family to remove dead, accumulated branches and small overstocked hemlock trees, protecting the forest from fire and making room for careful harvests. I envision these small diameter trees becoming the new Northwest timber, 21st century mass timber, of becoming mass timber panels and storing the carbon of the forest in the walls and the ceilings of our cities for the next 100 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. So Toby, you want to give your thoughts here? I think you're still muted.
Can you see that, Johan?
I can see that.
Okay.
You can go if you want to.
Sorry?
If you want to, you can go full screen.
How is that?
View.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, Susan. That was very, that was much more poetic than I'm going to be. And thank you, Susan, for making it possible in the US to build with material. For the audience, I can say that from the outside, that really was a war. It's been a war, right? So we have very established interests in construction. It's our biggest economic sector in the United States. And like healthcare was and still is to a large extent, it's very hard to change. There's very big stakes. There's a lot of money at stake on individual projects, and innovation in construction is extremely difficult because the margins of builders and architects and almost everyone involved are very tight. So to come in and do what Susan's doing or a number of other people are doing and be able to pay for it is hard. At Forterra, where I work, which is largest land trust in Washington, as a nonprofit, we've been able to undertake some innovation around mass timber because we're able to have grants and money that doesn't have to go back to investors yet. We also have social impact funds, but the experimental work that I'm going to talk briefly about really is coming out of the nonprofit world, much like the other speakers and many of the things they do, either pro bono or otherwise. Forterra started as a traditional land trust, buying forests, conserving them, farmland, working forest and wildland. Starting about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was the realization that unless we linked those forests to the way we build and do so rationally, we are not really going to solve for climate change in any meaningful way. And it was a tough realization because, like most people in the land trust world, we believed very strongly that we were doing God's work and we had a model that was extremely successful. But it had a ceiling on it, which is one organization, one culture, one fund can really only buy up so much property and sequester so much carbon by buying so much property. At the end of the day, the market is going to determine whether the forests, our natural resources, are used efficiently or not. And if we're going to have those natural resources used efficiently, that means coming in downstream of the forests on the construction side and trying to prove out that there is a way to build with lower emissions. And so I saw in the chat some of the questions about carbon sequestration, why, how, where. I'm going to try just very quickly to answer those. At Forterra, we try to answer with forest to home. And I'll just go into few details about our program. It ends here. This is where we are today. I'm sitting in our factory office where we just finished a prototype unit, mass timber modular unit. That's not a rendering, that's actually inside the unit. But we'll come back to that. Our mission in the Forest to Home program is really to connect, as I said, the forest to our built environment. And that itself is dependent on social justice, in our opinion. And what I mean by that is, if you can't solve for the ownership of land and how we as a society came into possession of that land from the native peoples, you really can't solve for any other problem, whether it's environmental or otherwise inside of our society. Put another way, if we can't care for and work for and center our marginalized communities, how are we possibly going to solve for something as abstract as a tree's rights or a river's rights or anything to do with climate justice? And what that means is looking very hard practically at the way that the land was stewarded sustainably by the native peoples for tens of thousands of years. And so forest restoration, how we build, also is related to stewardship of land. And that's all part of Forest to Home. The challenge, of course, is this. On the left here, that's an actual picture from the Ruby Timberlands, ravaged by a clear cut. It was to the point where when I was last there, this land was auctioned last year. They were literally digging the cedar stumps out of the ground, old growth stumps that have been cut in the 20s, to get just those last cedar shakes out of the stump. We have extracted our lands in Washington, in the West. We did so in the East several generations ago, to the point where the soils are degraded. Yes, evergreens will continue to grow in a very different way than they grew there, and in a very different rate of carbon sequestration than they did generations ago. Why? Because we're building things like what's on the right here. And when I see what's on the right here, after learning from people like Susan and others, I just see fossil fuels. Because that concrete is really just limestone. And that limestone has been cooked. And it's been cooked to the point where every ton of it has caused many tons of carbon to go into the atmosphere. So what's on the left here is really what's on the right here. If you extract brutally all of your local natural resources, and we export in some years more than half of our Washington logs to Asia, and we import what's on the right here, which is the concrete, we're creating multiple problems simultaneously. We're making our construction extremely expensive to do because it's imported materials, and we're devastating our environment. So how do you answer both of those? We try at Forterra. We've been trying to do it for 32 years. I'll skip through this. We've tried as Forest to Home to connect a number of innovations over time. So over our history, we've purchased and conserved about 275,000 acres. We've done carbon credit sales and what we call conservation harvests, similar to what Susan was talking about, on about 16,000 acres. We've restored many miles of river. And now we are in the sustainable development space and CLT. And as I said, we believe that is all dependent on tribal stewardship. It's really linking how do you care for land to how do you restore it, because so much of it looks like that photo I showed, to how do you harvest it in such a way that it's renewable. On the left here, you can see a piece of land, 13,000 acres, that we bridge financed, closed at the end of December. It's not yet public. It's going to be out in the Seattle Times in the next couple of weeks, that we bridge financed for the tribe of Western Washington. It's the headwaters of one of our major rivers. And there is a desire in the tribal community and elsewhere to conservation harvest this. You can see that, see the clear cuts in here. Johan, can you see my mouse? I never know in full screen. Yeah. Yes? Yep. Okay. So you can see the clear cuts in here. You can see that when it grows back here, it grows back almost as a like a spider web. If you don't thin it, it will not have any chance of in any way returning to quote unquote old growth conditions, which means that you have to thin it, which means when you thin it, you have fiber available. So what do you do with that fiber? In our opinion, what you try to do is build a building with the longest lifespan as possible that has the lowest carbon footprint. And so if you do that, you get a longer cycle building than potentially a stick frame building. So you sequester carbon for longer, you get a healthier forest. You restore that forest in a second step. In our case, we are building a plant to build CLT modules. So CLT modules are just taking these big panels and turning them into 6-sided boxes. You build those modular cross-laminated timber. And this is what the final product looks like. This is the master bedroom of an affordable housing unit that we completed up here. Takes a lot of money. We're spending $168 million on this year. Again, it's only possible because of this really, really complicated capital stack of donations and grants and concessionary impact investors and government guaranteed debt. No one is benefiting enormously except, we hope, the society. That's it.
Thank you, Toby. And maybe just put a few numbers here so we're everyone here on this lovely talk is on the same page. So like concrete and steel in terms of carbon emission is almost 10% each. And we always talk about electricity production and why we want to have solar panels and wind. And electricity is about 40%, but here we're talking about almost 20%. So this is a huge part of reducing carbon footprint, which is kind of lost in the conversation because regarding solar panels and winds, we need to figure out and solve a bunch of very, very hard problems. This is actually a situation where we have a solution and we should definitely just try to implement that solution rather than trying to invent another wheel. I think that's something for everyone to keep in mind. Maybe just like talk about some more fun stuff instead of the problems. So as of right now, the building code in the US says 270 feet, whereas what's the actual, what can we technically, how tall of a building can we do? There's a proposal in Tokyo that is 1,150 feet by Sumitomo Forestry. Is 350 meters for us metric system people. So what are the limitations of mass timber compared to especially like the concrete and steel?
We can say that technically it should be, if you calculate just by weight and strength, it shouldn't be a problem. It can be higher than steel and concrete, but to fix it together might be a problem. And it might be a good idea to build some 20-story buildings, more than the 2-3 that are in the world before we build more. But
I don't think we know the answer to that question, Johan. It hasn't been built yet. There's so many different factors. The structural capacities, as Marie mentioned, are probably very easy and simple to do. But there are the other concerns of say, acoustics and structural that Marie's institute is looking at very carefully. I've sort of enjoyed the conversations I've had with the folks at Sidewalk Google over the years. And, there's a lot of discussion like, why can't we just do 35, 40-story buildings without any issue? There's also a building under construction in Milwaukee right now that is 17 stories over a 9-story base, culminating at, 26 or so stories. And that's on top of a concrete base though. And so I think it would be very regular to have 18 stories per our code that we end up writing. There's a number of them, as there are in Sweden and in Brock Commons up in the Vancouver, BC, that have been built already. I think that's going to be a really normal thing. And I do think that probably, potentially in my lifetime, we might hit the 35 to 40 range, but it's as much of a political issue to overcome as it is a technical issue. I don't think the technical issues are really the things standing in our way.
And maybe on that point, because how's the construction industry embracing this right now? Because that's one, as a developer, you kind of hit that people are not getting used to it. And it is an industry that is very prone to slow change, which is, time is not really on our side here.
I think it's quicker than we would have thought it was. It was really slow 7-8 years ago. It was pushing a rock uphill. In the last 12 months, I feel it's taken off. I mean, all of the plants are at almost full capacity. There's a general movement towards carbon sequestration that we're seeing everywhere, from the biggest corporations to the smallest ones. So we feel very optimistic about it. There's both the environmental story and there's a quality advantage, right? That's one that has been known in Europe for a long time. And some of the Scandinavian studies around the biophilic effects of wood on healing times, on lifestyle, they're strong.
Yeah, I would agree with Toby there, Johan. I think it's expanding exponentially. And even in the last year or 2 years, despite COVID, you see buildings going up all around the country in all different geographic regions. And it's been absolutely thrilling to see the rise of mass timber. If anything, we're catching up a little bit in Washington state, although areas of the country would look at the Northwest as just, leaders. Oregon has been a huge leader. And it's really exciting to see jurisdictions like Denver just passed a new law to have all of the ceilings exposed to buildings up to 12 stories using the new Type 4B codes. Just, I think it was 2 days ago. It was a unanimous pass by the State Building Code Council, 13-0. I think people are really changing their attitudes very quickly in the US about this.
And are there, in terms of how to construct the buildings, in terms of layouts, are there any limitations on that side in terms of uses? We saw there's a lot of mixed uses of the really tall buildings in Scandinavia. Are there any limitations just technically and otherwise in terms of how to program the building?
I mean, like any mixed use project, as you well know, Johan, you have to be very careful and get the team that is familiar with these kinds of buildings and has done that before. And that's layered on top of an element where you have to have people that are familiar with mass timber, because there are special acoustics issues and there's special vibration issues that you don't want to be, as an owner, a developer, surprised by late in the game. So at this point, I think we have the luxury of still being able to choose really experienced teams from contractors, structural engineers, and architects. And I think assembling that right team of people is really the key, because that collaboration is huge in these integrated design projects from the very beginning. And I can't underestimate that. Like you could easily make an issue, just a simple, calculation mistake or just not understanding what all goes in that pro forma, in that construction cost estimate in the beginning without, just very simply. We've gotten, I think, as an industry architecturally over some of the basic things, but really having that right contractor team, architect and engineer on board really will help the owner feel assured that the risk is going to be minimized as much as possible.
And Toby, for the people not knowing, could you describe a little bit more on the modular production that you've got going on, just so everybody understands that?
Sure. I see a bunch of chat questions around this. So one of the cool things about wood is, because it is a lighter material, the size of the prefabricated element that you can make in a factory is bigger. And what that means is that whereas a steel facade piece might weigh 10x, a wood facade piece might weigh 2x. Modules are really almost the simplest prefabricated element to make because they stack, right? So there aren't complex interconnections. Most people think modules are super complex because they're so big. They're actually the simpler one. If you make a prefabricated office building facade out of a wood framed curtain wall and you have to put it together like Legos on the site, that might be a really complicated Lego set where if you're off by, half an inch somewhere, it doesn't fit together. So you can do all kinds of prefabricated work, all kinds of volumetric modular, meaning there's an empty space, air inside of there, or you can flat pack it so that you put it together on site. The choices are really very wide, and you can hybridize it with concrete or steel and go even higher, is another option. We have structural engineers sign off to go to 11 stories with our CLT boxes. So each CLT box might have a bedroom and a bathroom in it. Think of a hotel room type size, or it might be a living room and a kitchen. We can stack to 11 stories with 6-sided boxes. I'm sure someday that will go, probably every year now, it will go up a bit. The advantage is that the module itself is structural. You don't need a skeleton frame to insert the module into.
Yeah, maybe also the big benefit there, unfortunately, Johan couldn't make the other Johan. And when you have a Nordic event, there's always 2 Johans. So we kicked up the one. So Johan Knaus from K2A was unable to join. But one of his lessons when conversation with him is like, they also do modular production. And a big benefit of that is that you have the production in basically a large warehouse apart from at the construction site, which means that he employs 17% of women in their manufacturing facility, which I would venture to say that there's not a lot of construction sites that have 1 in 6 is a woman, which is a very huge benefit to that way of producing things as well.
Yeah, the prefabricated piece, Johan, is really exciting because, there's the volumetric pieces, which Toby described really well and is the centerpiece of his Darrington Wood Innovation Center work. But the prefabricated elements are also something that I learned a lot about firsthand, where you can do these panels that are all prefabricated in a factory, in a clean and safe environment, and very, very precise. And that all of that design happens up front in the very beginning to coordinate these different prefabricated elements, so that when they get delivered on, in this case, a flatbed truck with a whole bunch of panels on it, they can be put up really quickly and relatively quietly, because there's not a lot of nails. There's some screws and screw guns going in, but it's also a very light construction, as Toby mentioned. So the concrete foundations are usually about 20 to 30% less of volume. And so these advantages, whether they're prefabricated volumes or prefabricated elements, I believe are the foundation for a lot of really key changes that are happening in the entire construction industry. And there's a lot, I like to call mass timber kind of a disruptor, where we're really, because we're coming together so early in these integrated design teams with structural engineers, acousticians, contractors, timber fabricators, and architects, we're really rethinking the way we build buildings in this country at a very, very elementary level. And it's really, really exciting to be part of that.
Yeah.
We can also say, when building in a factory, you can control the quality a little bit more as well. You built, it's not raining, it's not snowing, it's not windy. So you get much better quality control of the product, which should benefit the end user as well. And I think the studies of these prefabrication that's been done in Sweden with volumetric shows also that we build them much faster, 30% less time from start to beginning of from start to end of a project, and with a productivity that's 30% higher than normal construction work. So you get a lot of other benefits as well.
And Marie, do you have, how common is the volumetric production in Sweden right now?
I would say that about 70-75% of the wood buildings is prefabricated volumes, but most of them are lightweight with stud and rail system. That's not there. There are a few companies starting up doing it in these mass timber CLT volumes instead. So that's coming now, but it's 2-3 years that they have done that technique.
Yeah. And do you think that's because it's more common in Scandinavia with the sort of low rises, fewer stories than compared to the US?
Yeah, we can say that this industry, this light frame, it comes from building one family houses in factories, which we have done for 100 years. Now they just build them in more number of stories. So it's the same technique that was used.
So in terms of trying to incentivize more timber buildings, what kind of measures would you all think would be good things to put in place to trying to encourage it, more of it?
Well, I've been really encouraged by some of the work that the city council in Seattle actually has done in the past, where I think you're familiar with this, Johan, where we added extra height for buildings. And if it was, for instance, a living building, for instance, and that's been a really successful initiative. I think something along these lines where we want to incentivize us, the environmental performance of a building, the lower carbon footprint, to add extra volume or extra zoning abilities, capacities, less site setbacks, et cetera, more FAR, for instance. There's a lot of ways to work that, and that our codes locally are rather flexible to be able to allow that to happen in an incentivized basis. And that would be really exciting to see at a very, very local area, especially if it was designated towards affordable or workforce middle income housing, like our project is, for instance.
Yeah, I think you got to link carbon to cost, right? If you have more emissions, you should pay more.
It's interesting, actually, in Sweden, in terms of the financing you get, there's a lot of, if you get cheaper financing, if you do a green building, actually on the mortgage side as well, if you have a passive house, etc. Whereas that's not something I've seen here in the US at all, but it kind of goes through the whole stack of it, just on the financing side, but also in terms of you can get some other incentives in terms of a bigger building.
What's changing it in Sweden also at the moment is that you have to do a sustainability declaration, or to show how much climate effect your building is causing. And today you just have to declare what number you have, but soon there will probably be limitations to this. And this will also have a huge impact on how sustainable the building industry is. It's changing all of the building industry, not just for timber. All of the building industry has to start thinking about how to lower the climate impact by doing like that.
Yeah,
I think that's a really great point, Marie. And we've been involved in a lot of life cycle analysis studies. There were some comments in the chat, has this been quantified by life cycle scientists? And I am not an LCA expert, but I work with a lot of scientists across the country, from the Nature Conservancy to the Forest Products Laboratory to University of Washington. Researchers here are amazing. And it's really important that we do stand behind our words and that we can quantify it in scientific ways and not just an architect telling the story. And it's been really exciting to be involved. We just had 3 papers published last month that demonstrated a lower carbon footprint in the embodied carbon area between 11 and 50% compared to a standard concrete or steel building. And it's really exciting work to be able to see that.
So we haven't talked, there's a question about the safety of taller buildings, which I'm sure we can easily address here.
So in Europe, the regulations is the same requirements for no matter if it's concrete, steel, or timber. So they are about to have the same safety level for living in them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll just address that quickly. There was a big pushback from the fire community in this code process, talking about the life safety of tall buildings made out of wood. And those were the reasons for all of those fire tests. In addition to the 5 fire tests we did at RISE with Marie's organization, we also did 5 fire tests outside of Washington, D.C. at the Bureau for Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And while those of us in the wood community didn't really feel like we needed those per se, we were pretty confident based on a whole series of international tests that had been done in Europe and in Canada. There was the need to prove it on American soil, doing it American ways. And we had to understand what that meant. And we spent a lot of time writing those fire test protocols, and we built, again, 5 2-story structures out of mass timber in a controlled environment outside of Washington, D.C., and burnt them down 5 times, or tried to again, and they just didn't burn down. And it was faced with that kind of scientific evidence that the fire community eventually began to budge and begrudgingly sort of went along with the code changes. They were never quite super happy about it. It was a very emotional issue for them, but we did make change because of those life safety tests. It's a really good question.
And maybe just in terms of like the urban planners and like how design reviews goes in terms of the how are they raising timber buildings, and are there any bigger thoughts regarding TOD's transit-oriented developments in terms of having a bigger idea or plan regarding what the city wants our city to look like?
Johan, I didn't catch the first part of your question. Okay, so you're asking about TOD.
Yeah, well, TOD in specific, but also urban planning in general. What have you noticed that there are conversations, discussions going on in terms of what the plan is for our city to look like in terms of timber buildings, or is it more just in general and it's an added benefit, but it's not, there's not a grand thinking to try to incorporate more wood into our cities?
I think there's a lot of interest, but we're not making the big moves like Portland is. If you look at Portland's airport, where the new terminal is massive, beautiful wood terminal. There was a bill in front of the legislature, I think in 2017, Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, that required new Washington state government buildings to have mass timber components in them. It did not go through. And it's interesting because there's all kinds of subsidies built in that we sort of take for granted around the oil and gas industry that of course plays into concrete and steel. But we're not doing the necessary to support, like we could, we're doing some things, our own domestic timber industry. And there's not yet total alignment with big timber, between mass timber and big timber. It's better. But I think that's something that's going to come about over time and hopefully lead to the kind of urban vision you're talking about, Johan. But there's an opportunity for Seattle to lead, should it so wish.
I completely agree, Toby. I think there's, especially right now with the new mayoral administration and potentially leadership at Sound Transit levels changing, with council support, I think the city of Seattle could really lead at a large regional level. And there is awareness of this option, an opportunity, especially in the TOD, the transit-oriented development areas. We have these stations that are expanding. It's become, light rail has become a very big success and changed lifestyles for people all over. My young employees coming from all around the US are just like, they don't have cars, they just move around on light rail, and it's really exciting. And that's the way the city really should be in a new sustainable city. So to augment that with housing around those stations at a higher scale than perhaps the single family neighborhoods that are just have been traditionally, historically there. I think change does need to happen, and we need to take it seriously at a political level and at the leadership level in this city and in this state to show and demonstrate lower carbon construction opportunities and higher density opportunities for people to live in cities.
So especially Toby talked about it a lot in the beginning, like sustainable forestry is a huge part in this equation. So Marie, how are Sweden and the Nordics handling that?
That's always a difficult question to answer. There's a lot of discussions about sustainable forestry at the moment in the European Union, we should say, actually, in that case. But in Sweden, if you cut down a tree, you have to replant. And that has been the policy for 100 years or more now. And the forests are growing more than we harvest each year in Sweden as well, as it is in, I think, most of the US as well, if you look at it, and in the most of Europe. So that should be helpful. But of course, it's good to make long-lived products of the wood, so we actually store the carbon in the buildings for a long time, if we are going to look into that part of it as well.
So maybe follow up. Are there any specific type of trees being used? If it's pine, hemlock, or is it whatever is available? Or are there any particular woods that's more suitable for mass timber?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, Johan. I love the fact that mass timber can be a regional and local product or building material. For instance, we have SPF, and that's just a nomenclature for spruce, pine, and fir. This comes from southern British Columbia and northern Washington state. But then in the southeast, near the Atlanta area and all Arkansas, all the way across to South Carolina, they use southern yellow pine, which is another local pine from that area. Nordic lamb up in northern Quebec, which works a lot with the northeast mass timber buildings. They use a northern black spruce, I believe it is, eastern black spruce. And so that wood then that is in buildings in those areas reflects the natural environment and conditions that it is grown in. And I think that's another link to help people, especially in urban environments, to realize that their wood does come from a tree. And we do need to replant those trees, Marie, per Washington state laws, which are some of the strictest forest practice laws in the whole country, for good reason. We do need to respect those laws and help keep the health of our forests very high for all of us.
Great. I think it's 10:59 here in Seattle, so I'm assuming that it's 7:59 over in the Nordics. I think this is as good a time as any to wrap things up. So I want to thank you all so much. I've learned a ton. I had a great time. I hope that everyone else also has a good time. And hopefully we will see more mass timber buildings all over the world.
Thank you, Johan.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Johan. Nice to meet you all, Marie, and see you again, Toby.
Yeah, thank you.